All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Randeep, and I have the privilege of moderating the open banking session with our esteemed panelists today. We are the last segment of the day, so hang in. We're almost there. Just going to make a quick assumption here that most people are somewhat familiar with open banking. So after a couple of introductory questions, what we'd really like to do is spend more time covering more content. So some of the topics that we'll try to focus more on is, what does the future state of lending or in open banking look like? How is it going to be operationalized? What type of use cases are available? And how do fintechs or other technology partners participate in the open banking infrastructure? And I know this morning Gary indicated that in interest of time, we're going to forego formal introductions. So we can get started. Maybe Andrew, just kind of pass it over to you. If you can talk a little bit about why is open banking a priority? Like, why is it so important? And how exactly is it manifested?
Sure, happy to chat about that. And I think right off the top, the term open banking, I think, is actually a problematic one. It's really not, if you were a marketer, you would not come up with the name open banking. It sounds scary, like you're going to open your wallet or open your bank account to anyone. So we like to talk about consumer-directed banking, which really is about giving consumers or small business owners or whoever the ability to share their data in a way that helps them further their financial goals. So a very practical example in our world, as a company that helps consumers make great decisions about credit, if consumers want to give us permission to view their data, for example, their credit data, or their banking data, we believe they should have the ability to do so. And open banking provides a set of rules that allows that to take place, and essentially means that incumbents, the people that hold the data that consumers ultimately have generated, have an obligation and a set of rules within which they have to make that data available. And we think this is a really key piece of driving innovation in financial services in this country. We've seen in countries like the UK and Singapore and other markets that open banking has been a really important way for allowing both incumbents to offer new products and services, and also for allowing new entrants to offer products and services, and allowing consumers to share their data so that ultimately they can get the best deal possible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that context. So after the previous segment, which focused on data is obviously a core component of open banking. So Abby, maybe you could talk a little bit on what we need to do to build that awareness, educate the consumers, and build effective adoption for open banking.
Sure. And I can see this is like peak creeping on LinkedIn time or Reddit, whatever time, 2 o'clock is tough. So I'll try and tell a story about it. When we talk about open banking, it's really about APIs. And we've had this conversation in these kinds of rooms as opposed to where the conversation started. So everyone's heard about PSD2, GDPR, which are EU regulations. My dad knows what GDPR is, but he has no idea what PEPIDA is. And that's a Canadian regulation. And the reason is because when you look at how those conversations started, they started in the context of something that was going on 13 years ago, right? So PSD2 is a 13-year journey. And back then, we were using Mint and Yodlee. We wanted to see what all our accounts looked like in one spot. And the Europeans were looking at the payment infrastructure and trying to understand how they can drive innovation, because they didn't want PayPal to own the entire market in Europe. So they started on this journey of having conversations about how can they open up the environment to allow for more competition for national champions. And in the case of the EU, is for European champions to compete effectively with the large American companies. We haven't had that conversation here. Like, we haven't had the ability, and from a data perspective, we didn't have someone saying, hey, I want to remove that terrible information about me from Google and have this entire conversation with regular folks about what it means to have your data controlled by a large entity. So we're approaching this problem many, many years after the discussion happened somewhere else without having the opportunity to create that discourse with people like my mom and dad, who are probably going to have that same reaction that Andrew was talking about. It's like, open banking, forget that. You have to pull the cash out of my cold, dead hand, so I'm barely going to give you access to anything else. And so I think we need to think about how do we use these organizations to create that discourse, to create that advocacy, and we really need to focus on fintech champions. So some of the stuff that we've seen today, there's some pretty cool demos that I saw, financed by big banks that seem to have this very closed experience. I love Greg, but that's not an open banking experience, and I don't understand how Andrew or our organization are going to benefit from any of that stuff. So we need to really think about what are we going to try and drive in the market, which needs to be innovation from non-banking players, and how do we have that conversation, how do we use industry groups like this to actually have that conversation with people in a way that they care about it.
Yeah, no, excellent points, totally agree. And from a high level, could you talk about some of the key advantages and benefits for open banking users?
So open banking would be the consumer-driven and the business. For the business model, it opens up extreme possibilities for revenue streams. From the consumer perspective, it is based on efficiency and utility and stability, and in the efficiency in pricing in products, so that consumers can just get multiple levels of pricing and multiple access to different means of financing. In the utility model, they're looking at bringing together the family, their personal needs, their business needs on one platform where their interests are protected. And the stability in the right model, and I have to emphasize in the right model, they are protected. So it's bringing together one platform in a user-friendly model.
No, perfect, thank you. So Andrew previously touched on some of the other use cases internationally. So Jerome, maybe we can talk about what some of the key learnings were and what we can use from that for the use cases here in Canada.
Sure. So we focus in the auto finance space, both in North America and internationally. And clearly, when we look at a consumer loan, the data underlying that is pretty critical, on a whole, on many levels. So, we come at it as a non-bank lender globally, but also as a data provider through some of our other brands that process, close to 90% of consumer loans, auto loans. We're seeing dramatic changes in Europe, which are benefiting the customer as well as the service provider, and even outside of just the auto space, HSBC, ING sharing data on customers that are really benefiting not only their operating model but also the customer. So we're starting to see that in Europe. Clearly, Canada is well behind. I personally think it's the best thing for the customer from a consumer standpoint, as well as for the lenders. So hopefully, we get more traction.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The transparency is going to be a core component. So. Can't talk about banking without talking about regulatory requirements. So Avi, could you talk about the legal implications and what we need to do to actually implement open banking?
So I'm an engineer, so this is like a tough question for me. But I'll put it to you this way. So if we kind of look at payments, we've sort of figured out where the liability stands on when you use a payment transaction, right? So if you're going to do a card not present transaction, the merchant's screwed. If you're going to use a chip and PIN transaction, the liability is shifted to the issuer, but really they kind of make it the consumer's fault. Like if you hand your PIN out, it's over. And then we come to sort of open banking where we go, I'm going to authorize a bunch of folks to get access to my information. And so, we're a software platform, but we make it possible for enterprises to offer financing to their small businesses in like a Shopify model. We will do like a $500 transaction with a minimum set of data because, and we know that if stuff goes sideways, it's on us and our partners. And then if you do like a $500,000 transaction and you're using some of those cool tools that we saw, like who's holding the ball on those things? It's not well understood. And so I think that there needs to be a series of conversations about what we actually mean about who's going to access the data and where the liability resides. And then on top of that, when we think about the regulatory framework, when you call an API, and we look at some of the APIs that are in Singapore that are really well defined, because that's a small country, they can sort of define them and make everybody use the same kind of APIs. Or you look at some of the things like in Europe where like BBVA has a whole completely different set of APIs for open banking than somebody else. Like there needs to be this understanding that there's been this huge transition over the last decade, right? Like there's cloud plus mobile, and the APIs need to have a certain set of standards to make it feasible for all of us to use these solutions, or else we're gonna, like we use Flinks and Plaid and organizations like that, we're gonna continue to use them because it's just a better experience and things are well understood about what we're getting from that. We understand what we're responsible for in terms of protecting that data. And so as we think about how regulators need to think through implementing open banking, first they should sort of come out of that, walnut paneled rooms that they seem to be having these conversations in, and engage more of, us fintechs. I have to admit I was in one of those panels back in the day, or one of those rooms back in the day. But we need to really think about, it's a combination of policy and technology. So even the big banks who've been spending billions of dollars moving their infrastructure into the cloud, you might argue that makes the cloud infrastructure companies a core component of the services or financial services. And so as we think about regulations, it's got to be the combination of the two. And they need to engage more than a very few set of parties to help define what those are. Because our use cases are very different than auto finance, are very different than Borrowell. And so it's important that we have that process, and it's got to be kind of quick. We can't wait another 13 years, or by then, there is no options. We've already done everything that we needed to do.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Diverse group of stakeholders is critical to move it forward. I think, so the next question is probably going to be very relevant to the attendees in the room. So Jerome, maybe you could talk about the difference between potential relationship between the role of the bank, who are expected to be the first party to move forward with open banking infrastructure, fintechs, as well as technology partners, and how can these business models be monetized?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an ex-banker from one of the big 4 or 5, I can't keep track, there is a symbiotic relationship between the fintechs, the data providers, the non-bank lenders, and the banks themselves. I think we also have to consider, when we look at financing, we also look at where does the customer start their buying journey, okay? Whether it's a vehicle or a home or wherever, there's deeper integration into the actual purchase, whether that's on a marketplace, a retail platform, a wholesale vehicle, et cetera. So there is a huge amount of opportunity to integrate in a way that makes sense, share data responsibly, and monetize. Every player in that ecosystem brings some really deep and rich insight into the customer preferences as part of, because they're seeing a different side of that buying journey and that financial transaction. So the trick is, how do we work together to put the customer first and define our compliance rules around that in a way that is win-win. And I think there's a lot of progress already being made with fintechs and big banks, and I'd love to see more of that with some of the retail platforms as well as data providers.
Okay, great. And as a follow-up for that, so if you are a financial institution, what are the requirements to be a participating user in the APIs?
Okay.
So you would have to look at PEPITA and DIAC as some of the requirements to be involved in any kind of lending platforms.
Okay. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I mean, I just go back to my international banking days, where know your customer is key, right? And who has the responsibility to know the customer? And are we doing KYC at every single level? Because that makes no sense. Or can we get to a place where we can rely on mutually agreed upon KYC standards, right?
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Andrew, could you define digital ID and how it underscores open banking?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about digital ID. I just, one thing I wanted to add, just reflecting on some of the great thoughts from the other panelists. Avinash mentioned Plaid and Flinks, and those are both organizations that we have a lot of respect for and have worked with in various ways. I think even if nothing we've said so far has convinced you that there's a need for open banking, what I hope might convince you is that, in a way, the consumers are already ahead of this, right? Because screen scraping exists. I don't know, how many of you in your businesses use Flinks or Plaid or something like that, right? Probably a lot of us in the room. And if you think about it, this is like not, again, those are great companies, but the way the system is structured, these are not optimal solutions. So we use them at Borrowell in our loan business, where we want to understand that someone's actually getting paid. So what we really want is, say, 6 months of income history. Well, the only way for a consumer to give us that by using a service like Plaid or Flinks is essentially to give us their login, or you give those services their login to their bank accounts. And so that gives us the ability to see years of transaction history. It gives us the ability to see multiple accounts. It gives those services the ability to, in a nefarious scenario, actually make transactions. So it's like we actually want only a very narrow slice of access, but because of the way that the banking system is structured, the only way for the consumer to give us a narrow slice of access is giving us access to like the whole thing. It's like if you want someone to come and work on the outside of your house, and the only way to do that is to give them, keys that last forever to the house, and they can come back and go into your bedroom anytime they want. I mean, it's sort of a crazy system. So even if you're not excited about the potential for open banking, let's agree that we've got a problem now, and we need to fix it by giving consumers and businesses the ability to grant access in a logical way.
Can I ask you a question? So would you allow your customers who today, like I downloaded your app, I saw my score, it wasn't as great as I hoped. Would you allow your customers to then go and create another account, like a verified me account, and pick and choose from there? Because now you're going to force your customers to go through another process, download another app, and get a whole bunch of data. Whereas I would argue what I saw in that is there's someone who's willing to give CRA data, banking data, lots of really interesting data. There's obviously some APIs there that one fintech in the room was able to access. And it doesn't seem clear to me why you couldn't access all of that same data. And that's what the regulator needs to do. It can't be one organization that happens to be funded by 8 banks happens to only be the entry point, because now you've just destroyed the entire premise of driving innovation. Right, so I'm interested to know, because like I was talking to my buddy Dan, who's from Credit Genie, and he's like, I can't do it. You can't force the customer. They do point of sale financing. They're an amazing company and a partner, but they can't force the customer to go through 2, 3, 4, 5 things, because then you have a frankly shitty experience. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, look, and I think that gets back to the question of digital ID and how do you sort of like make all these pipes work. And I share your view that we can't have it controlled by market incumbents. It really does truly need to be an open playing field where there's standards and standards you have to meet. There shouldn't be, not anyone can set up a fintech and get data, but I think you're absolutely right.
Well, that's a changing role of the SASC, is looking at changing that role, and there has to be oversight into the regulation and the protection of the data of each individual, and that is what is holding back Canadians. We have such a good banking system. In Europe, it's based on cleaning up a mess. In Australia, it's based on human rights. In Mexico, it's based on different reasons that we have open banking systems. In Canada, we don't have a problem. We have a very good system, but we need to move forward in Canada, or else we're going to be left in 8th or 10th place in the world, and we're not going to be competitive in the long run. So consumers, and I agree, have to look at the open banking system and start to trust that we're going to put in the regulation and the oversight to protect them.
We're all in agreement. We love open
Yes.
banking.
All about empowering the consumer. And just to go back to you for a moment, can you just talk about from a high level some of the core business models and use cases that would be relevant?
So a long time ago, people would dream about one day owning a house, but yet they come into a position where they're going to get a mortgage. And people don't dream about one day being in debt. And what the open banking system does is provides platforms and models where people find solutions for how they want to live. They find the house that they want, they find the car that goes with it. You go into Starbucks, you don't just buy a coffee, you're getting the donut or whatever they offer in Starbucks that goes along with it. The open banking system provides a platform where all your financial wherewithal is there, and then it provides the solutions for your lifestyle, for your life. And that is really what the open banking system can provide.
Yeah, I would just add to that, so we believe really that financial transactions aren't just, a standalone thing. They're part of a buying journey that began a long time ago. And so we really want to, drive integration much further along, because to your point, like a customer doesn't dream of one day having a car loan or a mortgage, right? But they dream of having a car, they dream of having a home. And so financial products and solutions, we think, should be much more heavily integrated into customers' experience when they're going through selections and things like that, and so that it's not a waterfall, but it's a very integrated experience in terms of selecting the financial solution as part of their buying journey, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Talking about government, so what exactly would be the government's role in executing open banking and making it go live? So I'm just going to ask both Andrew and anyone else who wants to comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an area where we see a need for a really robust role for government. I mean, it's not all the time you hear people that run businesses say that, but in my view, this needs to really be government-led, because we do have large, smart incumbents, and if this is truly going to be a vehicle that increases competition, increases innovation, we need to make sure that there actually is fair access for institutions at various sizes and stages. So I think we need government as sort of a standard setter, developing some of those standards for APIs, perhaps certainly helping develop the governance for open banking in Canada to help answer questions like, who is allowed to participate, what are the sort of thresholds for participation, who owns risk, which was a question that came up, a great point that came up earlier, when something goes wrong, et cetera. So, when I hear the term industry-led around open banking, it always gives me sort of cold shivers.
Yeah, I think the regulators have a role to play in facilitating this move from governance, how they regulate market participants, also a dispute mechanism, right? How do you deal with disputes between fintechs, banks on things like privacy and compliance issues? So there's a whole ecosystem that has to be developed, and certainly the governments have to play a leadership role in that.
So the government in Canada has been looking since 2018 and then pushing forward to even more consideration to open banking in January, but yet not doing anything other than push it to Senate, I guess, in July, or the Senate's pushing it to government to make some decisions. And I sat on the banking committee, the G20 in Europe, and open banking was the big topic. And if the banks don't weigh in, they are in the best position, better than fintech companies, to really embrace open banking. But if they don't weigh in and they use, as you put it, the walnut walls, was it walnut? Or they use their legacy thinking, they are going to be left behind, and the banks will not survive open banking in the long run. The fintech companies will step in and take over. But if the banks embrace what they have and stop thinking like a bank, then they will be ahead of the fintech companies. And thank God banks think like bankers, because we will pass them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're trying really hard not to say that banks are screwing our customers. We literally, none of us serve the same customer.
I think I just said that.
But you were so nice about it. Like, if I just look at the bodies that exist today, whether it's Payments Canada with a whole bunch of banking folks on their board, or Interac, where I came from, has a certain level of control that drives those conversations. There is no one who's advocating for the folks in this room, and literally all of our customers are the ones that banks have rejected. And they acquired me as a customer when I was a kid because my mom opened that account. And it's so painful to go and find a better bank. All the others are kind of shit too, but man, it's so painful for us when I opened my Wealthsimple account. It was ridiculous. And so open banking is really about unbundling banking services. So I like to think of it as like the app economy. You should be able to go and pick the best provider out of the four of us for the use case that you want, and be able to share your information so you can go do that. Right now, it's so brutally hard that most people are not even going to bother, right? They're like, screw it, I'll just stick with the guy that calls me once a year. And what we actually need the regulators to do is to understand that position, to your point, is actually what's going to drive the future. And as an industry group, we need to spend the dollars still on cool conferences, but also on lobbying regulators to make sure that they understand our viewpoint on that, right? Because otherwise we're going to be left out and we're all going to have to go and start selling in the States.
No, for sure. As an ex-banker, I couldn't agree more. When I look at future state, I look across the globe and I look at companies like, Alipay and like WeChat and the type of ecosystem that they've developed, and I think that's a great aspiration. I know we're getting close to time, so I'm going to ask one final question. Open banking starts with banking data or transactional data, financial data. What type of data is expected to be requested, and then what other data sets could you see being available? And this is an open question to anyone. Yeah.
So I did my research on data and how do you predict whether somebody will default on a loan or not. And I think that in my doctoral research and my Master's of Science in Finance, there is if someone is going to rely on the existing FICO-based, and sorry, TransUnion, but the FICO-based credit score is so outdated that you cannot rely on the history of just credit. And in fact, in our lending practice, we don't look at just credit. So there is more information that is out there just in a credit application that is predictive to whether somebody can pay a loan or not. In coming to other conferences, they say, well, whether they have a Facebook page or whether they have a what are the other stuff out there, Tinder or whatever's out there, whether they have an account. That's the dating site, isn't it? Oh, anyway, but they're saying that this is a way you predict if someone will default on a loan or not. And in the last panel, I was listening to that, and they said, you don't have the data whether someone would default on a loan or not based on the current, whether they have a Facebook. So there's other data out there, but it has to be machine learning, where you're developing your model as you go along and collecting the information. But right now, it should not be based on just a credit score. That is really important. I don't have the full answer, but in years of studies, and continuing to learn, not just stopping at that point.
So, a couple of our businesses, we have a lending business, but we also have a consumer finance portal, which processes close to 90% of all the auto finance loans in Canada. And I think it's clear to us that we are looking forward about predictive scoring that's away from traditional risk scoring processes. So we spend a lot of time on, hey, what are the preferences, much more broader to the customer than just, how many times was he late on a phone bill? So what are the more holistic preferences of that customer? We think that, again, being closer to the transaction, types of buying patterns, all of that tell us a better story about the borrower than just, their credit profile using some of the older, ways of looking at it. Right? So.
For sure. I think alternative data is definitely something we're going to hear a lot more of moving forward. So with that, I would just like to give a round of applause to our panelists. Very insightful discussion.